Let me begin by welcoming Professor Knapen from the Netherlands, who's going to be talking about aftershocks in the context of the economic crisis and institutional change. Let me just begin by saying a little bit about Professor Knapen's background. Professor Knapen is, as I mentioned, from the Netherlands. He's a student of history and economics, and he has a PhD from Tufts University. He spent, I guess, a good part of his career, distinguished career, in journalism as editor-in-chief for a leading Dutch newspaper. He's currently a member of the Scientific Council for Government Policy in the Netherlands. It's an advisory council for the Dutch government. He and I were talking just before the seminar, and he's just, I guess in the last couple of days, come back from Hanoi in Vietnam. We're very fortunate he's come here to speak today. I guess in terms of the kind of, I hate to use the term ground rules, but in terms of the talk, he's going to speak perhaps for 40, 45 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions. And when you have a question, if you could please give your name and your affiliation, and please keep questions succinct. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Adams, for introducing me. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a little bit too loud, isn't it? It's okay? For having me here, it's always great to be here. Not only because Singapore is a nice place, but also because it's an excellent place. It's an excellent crossroads for seeing, comparing Asian and Western perspectives. It's one of the few places in the world where there's a natural instinct to confront them, to compare, and to see where you can learn. And it helps a lot, because we all have our preconceived convictions, our prejudice, and it's nice, good, and important to test them whenever you can. And your dean here, Kishore Mahbubani, is a fine example of someone who is testing these convictions of the East and the West. And he's even so successful that if you go to Holland, you can even buy his books in Dutch. So, thank you again. And what I would like to do with you is, actually, as a member of the Scientific Council for Government Policy, we were asked pretty shortly after the highlight, the panic of the financial crisis, to come up with some sort of advice. And actually, we couldn't. We were still grasping to find out what was happening. To a large extent, we still are. But what we did is, we tried to do some sort of groundwork. Groundwork on where we could find the relevant questions that we had to ask ourselves. And where we could lay out some sort of groundwork for future possible answers to the questions that we got. So what we did is, in a preliminary way, we looked at about 25 of the most renowned scholars in the field of monetary, international, trade economics. We looked at some wise men with long experiences in policy making, being have a history in active policy. And we started to discuss the sort of questions that could be relevant. And then what we did was we molded this into about 25 essays. And basically, these essays, well, on the one hand, they don't tell you much as far as the answers are concerned, but they help us a lot in figuring out how we are going to proceed in trying to figure out what the consequences of this financial crisis may be and how to react to these possible consequences. So, and the subtitle already tells you something, because we very much like to focus on the institutional consequences that may occur due to the experiences of the last 2 years. Why? So this is basically what I like to do. I don't like to go into a discussion on the causes of this crisis, because we pretty much would like to look at the manifestations and the consequences. And there's a whole scholarly debate going on these causes, but that's not our focus. This is a little bit what I like to do. And basically, if you look to the institutional choice, institutional consequences, there are fine, convincing examples of the past. The one is obviously the Great Depression. Before the Great Depression, there was a laissez-faire ideology, intellectual framework on international trade, international finance, and on the role of governments. That role ought to be and was a very small one. Governments should not involve in economic policy making, in international economic policy making. Of course, the First World War already undermined this idea in the practical reality of life, but not in the theory of thinking. What happened with after the Great Depression, and it didn't happen overnight, but it happened gradually. But looking back, you can see that the Great Depression more or less provoked this, was, well, what especially in the field of sociology, they're calling embedded liberalism. Liberalism in the way that private enterprises, free market, free trade was what you would strive for, and was the way to create growth, create wealth. But there came a role for governments in two respects. In one respect, it came as a national agent, managing social policy, managing supervision. This is what, well, it happened in most countries in the West. The United States is, of course, a famous example. It started with the New Deal. It didn't start with the New Deal. It took 4 years before they started with the New Deal. So between the moment something happened and the first more solid structural transition of policy, it took 4 years. And so you had a whole array of activities where the state got involved in, from some elements of social security, some elements of health policy already, huge infrastructural projects to stimulate the economy. The Stock Exchange Commission got its main license to operate only after the Great Depression. So supervision. And then, again, it took another 10 years. And and a world war to translate this attitude into an international framework. The whole Bretton Woods system came out of the Second World War. But as an intellectual exercise, it came up in the 30s. And the Bretton Woods system, with the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, but also the way the United Nations was constructed with the Security Council, was typically the international component of embeddedness of liberalism into a system. It's all the West we're talking about up till now. Only when we come to the question mark, we will open up the world. It worked fine, at least for the West it worked fine. And it was a Western exercise. I mean, if you look to the way power was divided among nations in the huge institutions, it was the outcome of the Second World War and nothing else. So Germany is not a permanent member in the UN Security Council, although they're the second or the third largest economy in the world, because they lost a war 65 years ago. So it's all a long time ago, but it has been there ever since. Now this whole array of institutions worked fine until the beginning of the 70s. And the beginning of the 70s of last century basically gave a major shift. I don't want to dwell too much on it, but just to emphasize that specific events have institutional consequences, but they only come over time. The 70s for the West had a strong impact in terms of we had two major oil crises, oil shocks, and the United States was forced to let the gold dollar standard go. We had a period of stagflation, high inflation, no growth. The outcome of it, the intellectual outcome of that period was a reduction of the role of the institutions, of the public institutions and the state. As we all know, they had a famous saying by the late American President Reagan. He taught at least one or two generations this famous phrase, government is not the solution, government is the problem. This idea of neoliberalism had a very strong impact all over the West and gradually all over the East. In the country where I come from, the Netherlands, which has a system of high of income redistribution, of social benefits, of welfare, in about 10 years' time, it gradually provoked a sort of revolution. We deregulated a lot of institutions. We privatized a lot of institutions. We reduced the size of governments. We reduced the size of regulation. Deregulation was one of the buzzwords of this period of time. And to some extent, it went, free markets changed in being just a means to an end, as an end in itself. Now, one may argue that this has come to a stop. Not in terms of re-socializing, renationalizing, whatever was possible, but the holy grail of privatization has come to a stop. People are looking to free markets again more and more as a means instead of an end. And what will the next phase be? When we discussed with the people in our book, they all pointed to, hoped for, intended to do more research on possibilities of what we called embedded globalism. Why globalism? Because this can only function when the globe, which means in this case especially Asia, is involved as a pillar in the system, which it never was in the past. Why embedded? Because the financial crisis told us that internationalization, transnationalization of companies, of finance, of communication, is a risky thing when it is not embedded in regulating structures. Actually, the lessons learned in the 30s, but then on another scale, taking into account another part of the world. This is what I will end with a question mark, so I won't give you a final answer, but this is where we basically are heading for. What we found in a first short analysis was in that the first reactions towards the financial crisis were very successful. But it felt rather unreal. I mean, if I would have asked you 3 years ago that it would be able to imagine that in the United States the two biggest insurance companies would be more or less nationalized. One of the biggest banks would have as the major shareholder the American government. If you would have predicted that the Royal Bank of Scotland would be mainly a national bank, that the biggest bank in the Netherlands, ABN AMRO, would be completely nationalized, when the German Commerzbank would be to some extent nationalized. If someone would have predicted that 3 years ago, he wouldn't have gone very far in the curriculum, I guess. This is the reality at this point in time, so it feels rather unreal. Now, this is not unusual. If you look to 1929, it took at least 4 years before people started to realize that something had changed in a fundamental way. The first reaction usually is a reaction without an idea, without an ideology, without a theory. So it feels also a little bit uncomfortable. I remember our government, when they had to nationalize our biggest bank, the first week they said, well, next year we will undo this whole thing. Half a year later, everyone said, well, it may take 3 years. Now it's going up to 5 years. And who knows? There are serious problems in the West. I come back to these later, but in the West there are serious problems. There were serious, and still are serious risks of deglobalization. If you have a bank in the Netherlands with huge activities in the United States, and the Dutch government of the Dutch taxpayer has to guarantee the assets of that bank in the United States, they cannot, because it's too big, it's too much. So what they do is they withdraw. That's what's happening in several parts of Europe and in the US. If governments are subsidizing car industries, you're pretty close to protectionism and deglobalization. So this is a risk. The employment crisis in our part of the world is not a risk, it's a fact. You have unemployment figures in Spain, 20%, Greece, 22%. You have them in Britain, over 50%. This is a fact. And it's a very expensive fact if you have high unemployment benefits. We have a pensions crisis. All these retirement benefits, people save money. Well, this money didn't fare too well in the last 2 years. So what you see all over Europe is retirement age is going up. Some countries you have strikes, in others you don't, but it's going up. It has to go up. because you have to work longer in order to be able to retire. The fiscal crisis. All countries have huge deficits at this point in time. It's obvious because if you put all this money in the system, at some point in time you have to earn it back. So debts have been rising tremendously. In the economic scholarly debates or fears about the fact, is it too high or is it manageable? Someone like Paul Krugman tends to say it's manageable in the US. Now Ferguson tends to say it's the beginning of the end of the US. So we don't know, but it's serious. We guess there will be prolonged, slow growth. Because all these things have to be paid for. One of the unfortunate surprises was due to the dynamics and the vitality of Asia, that something didn't happen what used to happen in the past, which is after such a crisis, commodity prices not only go down, but they stay low. That didn't happen. It only stayed low for half a year, and then it went up gradually. So for the West, it doesn't help very much. And people in Europe are not very optimistic at this point in time. It's one of the reasons I like to be here is I always think you can smell it in the streets. If you ask people here, do you think the next generation will be better off than than this one? 90+% will say yes. If you ask the question in Europe, between 60 and 65% will say no. And that's not something what just started, by the way, due to the financial crisis. It's something which was already going on the last 6 or 7 years. Now what you see is, I referred to that already a little bit, what you see is in Europe that institutions have had to come to the fore. Although everyone was trained with the attitude that institutions should step back, they had to come to the fore. They had to re-regulate. It poses a huge question for Europe. I will come to that later on a little bit more into depth, because that's a fascinating thing, I think, but maybe one of the outcomes of this crisis. But for Europe, it also put the question in the front, who should act? If you say institutions are becoming more and more important, then the question is, which institution? We in Europe, we don't have, Europe is not a sovereign state, but the member states of the European Union are not that sovereign either. I will give you some examples of this, because this is really a dilemma that all of a sudden everyone is facing. And it goes at the heart. It goes to the heart of the matter of sovereignty. What we are discovering gradually is that sovereignty of all these member states of the European Union only goes so far. That it sounds nice, and from a psychological point of view, people tend to stick to a sentiment of sovereignty. It gives people some sort of identity in a globalized world, feeling to belong to something. As far as the new member states in Europe are concerned, there is a sentiment which you may compare a little bit with sentiments you have in this part of the world, where independence is a rather new phenomenon of the last 40 years, where people still remember that they fought for their independence, but they're still busy with nation building, still busy with tendencies of separatist movements. So that makes sovereignty a very sensitive issue. On the other hand, if if you stick to sovereignty in a world of embedded globalism, your capacity to act will diminish. If you want to act, you have to pool sovereignty. And that's really at the heart of what in international relations theories people are calling the integration dilemma. If you integrate, you lose autonomy. If you don't integrate, you lose influence. And it's a square circle to some extent. But I will explain it to you by a very specific example, which is really an outcome of this crisis. As you know, 16 countries in Europe have one currency, the euro. It's a new currency, an unexperienced currency, 8 years old. But pooling your monetary capacity into one system is really pooling sovereignty. Because as a state, you lose your own independent capacity to act in the monetary field. You cannot devaluate, you cannot revaluate, you cannot play with this essential instrument of economic policy anymore. Now, on the other hand, fiscal policy has never been integrated. It's still national. From a sovereignty point of view, this makes sense, because taxing citizens is at the heart of sovereignty, because at the end of the day, if a citizen doesn't want to pay his taxes, you have to be able to send the police. So the monopoly of violence, in this case, is within the realm of the national authority. So pooling that goes rather far. But not pooling that makes it very complicated to conduct economic policy. Now, this was not a problem in times that institutions were the problem and the free market was able to solve whatever problems occurred. But as soon as you have a sort of return of the state in the role of an actor in economic policy terms, it becomes a pivotal question. And it really creates dilemmas, because who is supervising a bank? I mean, if in my country a bank had to be bailed out, it was the national fiscal authority who could bail out a bank, because there is no European tax system, there's no European taxpayer, and eventually bailing out a bank doesn't mean anything except that the Minister of Finance is bringing up all his taxpayers and their capacities as a guarantee in order to avoid a bankruptcy. So this is a national thing. But if you have banks operating all over Europe, and Europe is an internal free market, then who is supervising these banks that have to be bailed out by a nation state and not by European Union? There have been discussions going on now for a year how to organize this. And if I would try to explain the compromise they found, it would take me at least a whole weekend. But they are gradually moving towards more European supervision and more European authority to act. Because it's the only way to save the crucial elements of this international system. And that's one of the... I do hope you have some time for discussion. Well, it's my fault when we don't, so I won't talk too long anymore. So one of the preliminary conclusions of what is happening at this point in time, there are a couple of things. First of all, this financial crisis showed what you could read already for years in international affairs, international economic affairs magazines, in scholarly work, but people very slow to realize that there's really a tilt towards the east. We used to have a gathering of the 5 leading economic nations in the world. Started in 1975, in the middle of this, between the first and the second oil shock, 1975, when you had this economic social paralysis in the West. Were the 5 leading nations in the world. Then gradually it went up to 7. And then after the Soviet Union fell apart, at some point in time it went up to 8. So Russia came as number 8. This went on and on and on. Just before the financial crisis, you had a meeting of the G8 in Germany, and there the Chinese president, the Chinese prime minister, was invited for an hour or an hour and a half. They gave him lunch and then they said goodbye again. And only shortly afterwards, after the real shocks of September 2008, this whole G8 disappeared. It's just not there anymore. If you want to learn about it, you have to study history. It's gone. No one said goodbye. No one said sorry. It's just gone. This meeting in close to Washington in the end of it was at the end of October, beginning of November 2008, was called the G20. And now one can argue which countries do belong in it, which don't. My country managed to be G22, by the way. But they participate under the name other participants. The other participants is 21 and 22, which is Spain and the Netherlands. And it just happened by a moment of luck, I guess. But it doesn't mean very much. I mean, it's nice to be there. It's always nice to be at the table and to get acquainted, but it doesn't mean very much. There is, some people are arguing that this G20 is a nice framework without much implications. And basically, if you want to have embedded globalism, you will need 2 major powers, the United States and China. Some people are talking about Chimerica, although I don't see the pooling of sovereignty between these 2 in a way that you can choose one name. But anyway, it will be pivotal what the relationship will be between these 2 for all sorts of issues in what we would like to save, which is a multilateral world. And it also means that for 2 countries with not much of a love towards multilateral systems, China and the US, they both, from a ideal point of view, it would be great if they both would be able to learn to adapt to a system which is multilateral, because that serves all others in the world very well, and at the end of the day, the main participants too. One of the other things, what you learn in this crisis is that there is something arguable about the relevance of Europe. It is, if you look to GDP, it's of the whole European Union. It's larger than the US. It's way larger than China. GDP of the Eurozone is about as large as the United States, but it's not one state, so you can only measure that to some extent. There is something with the relevance of Europe. If you look, for instance, to the permanent seats in the UN Security Council, you have France and Britain. You don't have there a seat for Europe, because Europe doesn't exist as a state. So you have France and Britain. You don't have India. Why? Because it was a colony in 1945. That's after 65 years later. This is a strange reason, but that's the reason that they're not there. There's no seat for Brazil, but there are 2 seats for Europe. There's no seat for Germany. There's no seat for Japan. There's no seat for Japan because they lost the war 65 years ago. At some point in time, this has to change. The same, and you know much more about that than I do, but the same is going on with the IMF. Still, the United States has, the veto line is 50%, so the United States is a little bit more than 15, 17 is it, I think, 17 point... 17%, yeah, 17. And China has?
China has about
three, yeah. My country, together with, my country is representing a group of smaller countries, together with the group my country is representing, they have 4.8, so a little bit more than China. So, something there is wrong, and this cannot go on forever. If in 20 years' time this would be the same, it would be irrelevant, because it doesn't represent what the reality of life is showing us. And for Europeans, although they tend to be rather skeptical about further European integration, it may mean at the end that if they want to have any relevance and if they want to take into account the pivotal role Asian countries and other newly developed countries are going to play, they have in Europe to pool sovereignty in order to act on a scale that is relevant in supporting a multilateral system. Now, that is obviously easier said than done. And it may even be much more complicated for other regions in the world. I mean, pooling sovereignty for ASEAN, it's still far away, I guess, if it's even the road that has to be or will be followed. But still, for middle-sized powers in this changing world, they will, at some point in time, face the dilemma of autonomy versus influence, of being an actor in a broader scale in a multilateral system, or being, to some extent, irrelevant. Now, that for Europe, it may still be very far away to see it as a state. To be quite honest, for me, it's still for me. Although I like it a lot here, I also feel at home in Europe. But I cannot. It's hard for me to imagine it being a really a state in a traditional sense. I don't see them having a huge army, for instance. Now, the question, of course, is how important is it in a modern world? Hard power didn't serve the US very well in the last 10 years. In Iraq and Afghanistan. And in a world where you have many new actors, not only states, but citizens, non-governmental organizations, corporations, communities, media, soft power may be, at the end of the day, much more important in supporting multilateral systems than only the acts of states. And if, as far as soft power is concerned, Europe could bring something to the table. Because what is soft power? It's about reputation, legitimacy, trust, reliability, cultural attraction, all sort of things that have to do with building up a long haul in terms of trust and let's say moral authority. And there are opportunities, many opportunities, which don't have that much to do with having a huge army or having an army whatsoever. So that would be one of the things to work on in the future. Where does this all lead us? Well, I promised you that I would end with a question mark, so I will, because we haven't finished yet. The only thing what you can see is that history tells you that there is time after a crisis like this to find out how institutions mold, how institutions change, how institutions adapt in a way, and that's probably a political interest for Europe and a political interest for countries in this region of the world to adapt to a system where you can save the positive elements of multilateralism that have been built after the Second World War, and at the same time reconstruct it in a way that the new countries, the new important countries, can and are able and like to play a role in it. Because for every smaller, middle-sized region in the world, this is pivotal for our future. So this is basically what we have been figuring out and where we would like to continue working on. And please don't excuse me for not having the right answers at the end of the day, because we're only at the beginning. But these are the question marks with which I would very much like to leave you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and stimulating talk. Maybe if I could just begin with one question and then open the floor to general questions. When I think of some of these changes in terms of shifting relative power in the world economy, the role of the IMF, representation of different groups, there are certain trend changes underway. How do you think about to use the term aftershocks, how do you think about the potential effects of the crisis? Is it to speed up some of these shifts that were already underway, or are there fundamental changes in direction? We have the role of the state, and to some degree we see a cyclical pattern. We see the role of the state increasing, then decreasing, and it's not clearly a cycle that necessarily goes anywhere. But how do you think about the crisis? Is it predominantly in its ability to speed things up, or is it to, in a sense, change any of these things in a fundamental way?
Well, it depends a little bit on how you translate speed things up. One of the things we really don't... let's take the history of the United States as an example. It took the United States 50 years and 2 world wars to be able to play an active role in an international multilateral system. That's a long time, and with some rather devastating events underway before they got there. I mean, they participated in the First World War. They started in 1917, and well, then they had a President, Wilson, who wanted to become a member of the League of Unions, etc., etc. He was kicked out of office. And then again, it took another war before taking on that responsibility. Now, and obviously, it was a two-sided sword, because responsibility for a multilateral system in which you're an hegemon is attractive as well. But still, the Marshall Plan and things like that were an expression of feeling responsible for world affairs. Now, what about the capability and the willingness of new, developed, rising countries to play an influential, responsible role in that multilateral system? We don't know yet. As far as I can see, a country like China doesn't know yet either. They're a little bit puzzled by it. And if you talk to people and read how they are discussing matters like this, they are really still a little bit puzzled on what sort of role to play. Now, it's very hard to blame them. If I refer to the United States, which took half a century to figure out some sort of a role, then this cannot happen overnight. But still, I think finding, although there are a lot of difficulties underway, finding a way to mold new developed countries into a stakeholder model for the multilateral system would be in the best interest for all of us. Because the alternative would be nationalism, animosity, fights for hegemony, all sort of things where the big majority of countries in the world and people in the world are not benefiting from. So, and I think that if the West is prepared and has the mindset to step aside a little bit more and a little bit faster, and to accept that there are new states who have to take on responsibility, it may happen. It may happen. But that's more a question of pessimism versus optimism than analysis, I have to agree.
Thank you. Can I open the floor to questions over here?
Hello, Professor. Thank you for a very informative talk. I'm wondering, just now you talked about who was just invited for lunch before the crisis, and after that, and then this G8 was gone. So this is clear. This is, for me, this is a very clear example of how economic power shape the institutions or alter the institutions. I would like to know how the institutions also impact the economic power. This is quite relevant because for China and other Asian countries or the emerging economies to become a sustainable economy in the future, what are the institutional changes do you think that must be in place to sustain this growth? Or what are the obstacles that they face? Thank you.
Let me take the example of the currency issue at this point in time. Everyone in the outside world is complaining the fact that China is playing with its currency. And ASEAN has a lot of problems with it because you have a balance of payments problems with China now, and you cannot compensate for exporting to the US. We in Europe are complaining because the euro is so new that it has to be very stable, and since it has to be very stable, it's too expensive actually. So we have export problems. In the United States, they complain. Basically they complain because they think China, again after the 2008, started manipulating the currency. Now, the other side of the story is the US. In the 70s, there was a minister of finance in the US. What was his name? He was the guy who was sitting next to Kennedy when Kennedy was shot. Connolly, I think. Connolly, because he used to be governor in Texas. He used to say in the 70s, when foreigners came to Washington, he said, well, listen, the dollar is our currency and your problem. And what did he mean by that? Basically that when they had problems, they just devaluated, inflated the dollar. And what's happening now is that the US, again, they have a huge pile of debt. Debt in foreign countries, in the foreign world, and if you have your money saved in these dollars, you see them devaluating every month. So, and that's a power you have when you have a dominant currency. Because if you have a dominant currency, you can push a button and print dollars. If you're living in Iceland, you go broke, which is what's happening. So it doesn't matter much to start a discussion on who's to blame. What matters is there a system in place to address these imbalances? Now, an IMF, a new IMF, should be able to manage these disbalances. In one of our pieces, Barry Eichengreen is working at the moment on concepts to create all sort of funds, surplus funds of countries to manage this disbalances, because this disbalances is one of the causes of the financial crisis anyway. Now, there are opportunities for institutions to address issues like that. But the requirement to function is that the members, the players in that system, want to play in that system, want to take the risk of trusting each other, want to take the risk of having some short-term disadvantages in order to have long-term advantages. And this is something that doesn't come overnight. And it means a lot for especially for new developing countries to step forward and not only to ask for influence, but to take on that sort of responsibility. But the concepts to manage this huge disbalances, which basically it's, I mean, what China is doing, what the US is doing, it's pretty much the same like protectionism in the 30s. If you manipulate your currency, it's basically the same. There is institutions are in place. I mean, they have to change. Well, the Pittsburgh Declaration of the G20 is referring to possible changes in that. So it's possible. It can be done, but it isn't there yet. And mainly up till now, when you deal with issues like this, what reigns is distrust.
Could I just mention on that point? I mean, the Americans may be able to devalue the dollar against certain currencies, but presumably the issue with China is they can't devalue the dollar against the renminbi.
Exactly.
And that's the constraint. But on this whole issue of imbalances, there's a perennial problem that the pressure on surplus countries is usually not there. The pressure is usually on the deficit countries. And the difference this time is that the large deficit country is the supplier of the international reserve asset.
Yeah.
So you've got a combination of factors which any regime is going to have difficulty dealing with.
Yeah. Well,
New or old IMF.
It's a terrible cliche to say we live in transitional times, because we always do. But fact of the matter is that if you look to the longer term, it's hard to imagine that the dollar will still be the prevailing currency. This cannot happen if you see the change and the shifts in economic weight in the world. So how do you organize that shift? That can only be organized by international institutions or by chaos.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the transitions to new international reserve currencies will raise a number of issues. Maybe.
What would be the? Yeah, tomorrow, Monday. Yeah, well, you know, if you look to relative weight, I have something of the relationship between GDPs. So I didn't show you because if you look to GDP can you see it? This, if you see, the dark blue is the US. Now, that used to be much bigger. And obviously, you never had the euro, so you had a whole bunch of smaller and bigger currencies, and the Deutschmark would have been one-fourth of that big EU part of the pie. If you see, the red one is China. That's going to be bigger. Now, at some point, the currencies have to have some relationship, some reflection on the weight of an economy. Now, if you could change it by hand, all of a sudden you could just change it from one currency to another. That's not what's going to happen. The way the dollar came into the position of dominating currency, that took 60 years. So these things don't happen overnight. What you see at the moment, from a just very practical point of view, is that surplus countries are shifting a little bit as far as possible, because there's not much choice in the world. They are shifting a little bit to other currencies and other sort of reserves in order to avoid this unilateral dependency on a little bit less stable currency that the dollar is. But still, the dollar is by far the leading currency in the world, and it will be that for a serious period of time. As I say, if history tells you something, you talk in decades.
There's a book, I think, down in one of the bookstores downtown on the coming demise or collapse of the dollar. It's in the 5th edition.
Yeah, but
we have a question over here. 2 questions.
My name is Juhan from Gunung Sewe, Indonesia. Since the financial crisis in 2008, some academics are arguing that China's model of socialist capitalism is the way forward. Do you agree with this view?
Yeah, it's a view. I don't know. To me, let me say, one of the things that always struck me is that Western predictions of things that are going to happen in Asia you can bet on that, are usually wrong. You come from Indonesia, so in 1998, 1999, most Western countries were rather sure that Indonesia would fall apart because it was a revolution, Suharto was kicked out, and it was not one state anyway, and all these islands with different cultures and traditions, and so it would fall apart. It didn't. Then everyone said, well, it won't fall apart, but it will be a bad place for decades to come. It's a fine place. I mean, you're still in the phase that you have to develop a lot, but you fared fairly well through this crisis. Then China. In the 90s, everyone was saying, well, China, 10% growth a year. And it's lasting every year. It's a ride on the tiger. When 1 year they can't manage this 10%, they will have huge problems. Revolution, social upheaval. Now, they still managed this growth. Then, 4 years ago, you had all these stories of 100 million Chinese wandering around in China looking for work, and this could come up, this could lead to some sort of upheaval, social unrest. It didn't happen. When the financial crisis struck, everyone was looking to Wall Street, and in November 2008, everyone was looking to China and said, well, China will have big problems. They will have big problems because they are addicted to high growth, and if they don't have high growth, they will have social upheaval. Now everyone is saying, well, China managed fairly well. So if there's one prediction of the West towards Asia, usually you can bet on it that it's wrong. That's in the Davos schedule of high risks, which came out yesterday. Risk number 1, the bubble in China. I don't know if you saw it on BBC yesterday. They have the Davos Forum, Economic Forum, World Economic Forum starts next week, and they always make these reports. I forgot what risk number 2 was, but risk number 1 was the bubble in China. Maybe it's right, but as I said, it's very often wrong when it's a prediction from the West. Now, if you ask me, has China a model? I don't know. I come from a region which grew up with the idea that as soon as you have a huge middle class, you will have some sort of governments that looks pretty much like democracy. Because the middle class has a vested interest in no corruption, good education, transparent rules, because they're not rich enough to take care for themselves, and they're not poor enough to don't care at all. So at the long run, that would be my prediction. So a new social model, together with a serious, huge middle class, is something for me very hard to believe in. But I use the word believe because I don't know.
Thank you for an insightful presentation. I'm Henry Gesquier. I'm a visiting professor here, and I'm like you, I'm also European. The question I would like to ask is, you mentioned that looking forward, it would be intriguing and challenging for Europe if they could exercise soft power somehow in the world. You mentioned we don't need to have military power for doing that. The question, and sure, I would say Europe has a lot to offer, if only to other countries, the example of the possibility of how economic integration has actually made it practically unthinkable of having wars within Europe, something which had occurred for so many centuries. You look at Scandinavia very often, it stands as an example of how to organize society in a progressive way. Europe has a lot to offer. My question is, would Europe not need to have more solid, firmer economic growth in order to be relevant? It may not need military power, but without economic growth that is higher, obviously not on the order of magnitude of what we see here in Asia, but more profound economic growth in order to be of relevance. And is this part of your discussions that you have in the context of the crisis?
There is a huge discussion going on. It may sound a little bit opportunistic, but there's a big debate on what do you call growth. If you see the Stiglitz report on it, you may be familiar with it. What are we talking about when we're talking about growth? Is it just confined to traditional economic figure? Does it take social well-being? Does it take sustainability? Does it take all sort of elements into account that count for the well-being of society? Or is it only fixed on financial measurements of GDP growth? Yeah, sure. No, you want to?
I entirely agree. In fact, I use the Stiglitz report in part of my classes.
But voila.
Okay, but I think we all know if. Sure, we don't want to make an idol out of GDP. We all know all its limitations. But what I mean with solid economic performance would be a situation where the fiscal situation is sustainable and is not careening towards a problem, where the employment, where there is employment creation to a much larger extent. I think that we can all pretty easily define what we would mean by economic success, which is greater than we have now in Europe.
If you're saying that if you want that you need to have your house on order to be relevant, then I fully agree. And that means that you cannot, as a society, you cannot go on living off the future of your children by postponing your debt problems, by raising debts. But, you know, something terrible happened, of course. In the 70s, in this stagflation time, welfare states, especially in the western and northern part of Europe, ran into huge problems. It took them about 20 to 25 years, in general, to come back to a solid position of public finances. You know, when the monetary union started, the euro was introduced. It was set as a rule that deficit should not be more than 3%, and the total debt of public debt should not be more than 60% of GDP. Now, most countries were there. Now this financial crisis had as an outcome, as a result, that it will take again another 10 to 20 years to come to that situation. And I fully agree that they have to get their house in order. But that is going to take a long time, and if not, and this is a prediction I'm a little bit more closer to, if not, and they want to do it faster, it will have serious social consequences and social unrest as a consequence. Yeah.
Okay.
You talked about this. I'd just like to continue from what he was asking.
Yeah.
In one of the latest, I think 2008 article, Danny Roderick writes that you probably this neoclassical economic way of looking at growth and all this has probably failed. There's no answer.
Yeah.
Now, when you were talking about a multilateral system, a new multilateral economic order, could you be considering or would you be thinking that it could be something which is not really taking a complete capitalistic view of growth?
We haven't, well, as far as taking other elements than just financial growth into account, I agree. And that's something what you hear. But
still, when you do not look at, if you look at this Stiglitz's paper of 2002, which talks about transformative growth, transformation as the growth process, still all the calculations and everything is done in terms of GDP. The nation states are compared in terms of GDP growth, not in terms of a Human Development Index, HDI. You will not find articles written on HDI.
No.
Right. So the point is, can there be an order which is international economic order which is not looking at markets as the prime institution for growth?
I hope so. And at least one of the lessons from this crisis is that that's the way we have to look at it. But, these things are not easy. We have no concept. We have some vague ideas, some vague normative suggestions on it. But if you go to, today, if you walk into a normal economics 201 class, you start with the efficient market theory. And then with a footnote that there is some behavioral unpredictability, and we have a new Nobel Prize winner, so you have to see it a little bit in perspective. But that's it. That's not a new theory. So before we adapt to a reliable set of ideas to reconstruct something like that, it just takes time. But I can imagine that that's the only future. Yes, one last question.
I'm a layperson, and from the perspective of layperson, we notice these two big problems. Firstly, with regard to the first slide that we have, when you talk about the Great Depression, the first layperson will understand one thing. When the thinkers start to do over-experimentation, over-expression, then there will be Great Depression. And the DEEP, not the previous depression. Now, secondly, with regard to the near factor, when you look at intellectuals, when you look at institutions, even universities, for example, I can find universities, for example, as and when the universities endowment, especially in America, is having great depression, what do you really think that from a layperson point of view, that the leaders, thinkers are no longer thinkers? They can't think, because look at Europe, for example, how many universities are running at a loss to. So you see the question here, put aside the speculators, put aside the bankers, put aside other people. How come that universities, faculties, and endowments, administrators don't have the brain power, maybe the soft power, whatever not, don't have the capacity to see what exactly it is. So there's too much friction that we are working on and slipping on. So we can expect that anyone to see the attention that the thinkers within the university umbrella themselves can't think. So we have a think tank that can't think, so we have a problem.
So you only have a tank and no... Well, I wouldn't dare to disagree with you, but but as far as we had these long sessions with these 25, I can assure you, they don't know the answers, It's hard to have answers for unknown territory, but they're solidly working on it, and these people they don't agree among each other altogether, but they realize that there is, in institutional terms, something is going to change. This is not something that will just, in 2 or 3 years' time, will be a small blip on the radar screen in the course of history. This changes something, and if you tell me, yeah, you don't give specific answers because, well, universities and thinkers can't think, yeah, maybe we're all rather human, so that's something it's hard to apologize for, but we have to take it into account. But people are working on it. I'm not that pessimistic as you may sound.
Okay. Thank you very much. If I could just leave with one thought or question, and maybe a European type question in terms of what the crisis might mean for the role of Europe when you think of this new system. You've spoken about soft power, the role or potential role of Europe in terms of soft power. How do you see the role of the euro and the role of Europe in this kind of system that evolves over time? Has the role of the euro been strengthened, or have the questions about the lack of fiscal institutions, inability to deal with cross-border banking problems, in fact, in a sense, given Europe its limits in terms of the role it can play?
I always imagine living in Asia, or especially coming from Asia, Europe is a puzzle. They have a flag and they don't. They have a currency and they don't. They have a government and they don't. It drives you crazy because you never know what it is. If you don't know what it is, I always tell my students to call it a system. So you have a system which is called Europe, which means that the direction is an uncertain one because there's not a government. What you can say is when we introduced the euro, we needed it because the huge volatility between these different currencies and the uncertainties of an internal market were very hard to manage without one currency. Or the other way would have been to pack currencies, but from a symbolic point of view, the euro had a preference. People in the streets disliked it. They hated it because they couldn't connect with it. In my country, we always had the Queen on it. No, Queen was gone. And at the same time, people said, well, listen, we had a Deutschmark in Germany, and now we have the euro, but when we had to pay 1 Deutschmark, afterwards we had to pay 1 euro, although 1 euro is 2 Deutschmarks, so everything got more expensive. So everyone felt betrayed. Typically, when European bureaucrats think of something, it ends up in betraying you. So they disliked it. Gradually, they got accustomed to it. And now what happened in October and November 2008, people start to love it. They felt extremely comfortable with the euro. There are even countries in Northern Europe that discussed participating in this thing, which they were supposed to hate. And Iceland even asked for the euro. So a currency is not a technical thing. It's also an emotion. You have to feel relating. You have to feel a relationship with it. Now, what's going to happen? I think that at this point in time, people in most countries in Europe don't want to go too fast with Europe because they want to feel comfortable at home. But gradually, they will get accustomed to it, and they will see that pooling sovereignty benefits. That's not something you can say on the marketplace tomorrow because there are many skeptics, but it's gradually happening. The euro performed quite well. Now, if you look to history, there should not be a future for the euro because every currency of different countries without one state, at some point in time went out of the window. But since the European Union is integrating, is gradually integrating, sometimes even without wanting to integrate, as I pointed out with this whole dilemma between monetary and fiscal policy, you see that it's, and with this whole dilemma of supervision, you see that facts create new realities, and realities point all in the same direction, and the direction is one of further integration. Now, it will go slow. It may go in a hidden way, because especially countries in Eastern Europe, they became member of the European Union not to integrate, not to lose the sovereignty, but to make sure that they had the right economic development and having the sovereignty at the same time. But gradually, this is going to happen. And if you take the changes in the world into account, it's the only way forward.
Well, look, thank you very much for a very interesting and stimulating talk. So thank you very much.
Thank you.